In the labyrinthine corridors of modern ambition, where digital empires rise and fall with the speed of market fluctuations, there exists a timeless truth that cuts through the noise of contemporary self-help platitudes and motivational rhetoric. This truth, forged in the crucible of political necessity and human nature's darkest recesses, reveals itself to those bold enough to peer beyond the comfortable illusions of moral absolutism. The year 2026 stands as a testament to humanity's perpetual struggle for dominance, relevance, and survival. In boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions materialize from whispered conversations, in startup garages where the next technological revolution gestates, and in the virtual arenas where influence translates directly to power, the ancient principles of strategic thinking have found new expression. Yet beneath the veneer of innovation and progress, the fundamental dynamics of human interaction remain unchanged, governed by laws as immutable as gravity itself. Consider the executive who, faced with the collapse of his company's primary revenue stream, chose not to panic or retreat into the familiar comfort of victimhood. Instead, he embraced what many would consider a ruthless calculation. He systematically dismantled every aspect of his former identity that had contributed to this failure. The sentimental attachments to outdated business models, the loyalty to incompetent subordinates, the deference to industry conventions that had become shackles rather than guidelines, all of these fell away like dead skin from a serpent's molting form. This transformation represented more than mere adaptation, it embodied the first and most crucial principle of unstoppable advancement, the deliberate destruction of one's weak self. The weak self clings to comfort, seeks approval, and maintains allegiances that serve emotion rather than strategy. It operates from a position of reactive vulnerability, constantly seeking to defend rather than advance, to preserve rather than conquer. Rule 1: Embrace calculated ruthlessness. The modern landscape demands a form of ruthlessness that transcends mere aggression or cruelty. True strategic ruthlessness manifests as the willingness to make decisions based purely on their effectiveness, divorced from the emotional comfort they might provide or the social approval they might generate. This principle does not advocate for needless destruction or sadistic pleasure in others' suffering, rather, it recognizes that extraordinary achievement requires extraordinary measures. When the young entrepreneur discovered that his closest friend and business partner had been systematically undermining their joint venture for personal gain, the weak self would have sought reconciliation, would have hoped for explanation and redemption. The strategic mind, however, recognized an opportunity disguised as betrayal. Rather than confront directly or seek dramatic satisfaction, he quietly documented the betrayal while simultaneously developing contingency plans that would not only remove the threat but position him to acquire his partner's stake at a fraction of its true value. The execution of this plan required months of careful preparation, during which he maintained the facade of oblivious partnership while methodically building an unassailable position. When the moment arrived, the resolution was swift, decisive, and utterly complete. The former partner found himself legally and financially isolated, with no option but to accept terms that left him with a minimal payout and no recourse for future interference. This example illustrates ruthlessness not as emotional vengeance but as systematic problem solving. The weak self would have been destroyed by the betrayal, would have allowed emotion to cloud judgment and create additional vulnerabilities. The strong self recognized the situation as simply another variable to be managed and optimized. Rule 2: Master the art of selective morality. Absolute moral systems, while providing psychological comfort and social acceptance, often prove catastrophically inadequate when navigating complex strategic situations. The individual who refuses to compromise their moral purity will find themselves consistently outmaneuvered by those willing to operate within the gray areas of ethical ambiguity. Selective morality does not mean abandoning all ethical considerations, rather, it means recognizing that moral frameworks must serve strategic objectives rather than constraining them. The pharmaceutical executive who discovered that releasing certain internal research data would save lives but destroy her company's market position faced precisely this dilemma. The weak self would have been paralyzed by the apparent contradiction between personal ethics and professional responsibility. Instead, she developed a solution that satisfied both imperatives through careful timing and strategic disclosure. By gradually releasing portions of the research through seemingly independent academic channels over an extended period, she ensured that the life-saving information reached the medical community while allowing her company time to pivot their research focus and maintain competitive viability. The result was a net positive outcome that would have been impossible had she rigidly adhered to either absolute transparency or complete secrecy. This approach requires the ability to hold multiple moral frameworks simultaneously, selecting the most appropriate lens for each specific situation. The key insight is that moral consistency, while admirable in abstract philosophy, often leads to suboptimal outcomes in practical application. Rule 3: Never reveal your full capacity. Power dynamics rely heavily on perception and expectation. The individual who displays their complete capabilities immediately places themselves at a strategic disadvantage by allowing others to prepare appropriate countermeasures. True power lies not in impressive demonstrations but in the careful management of others' assumptions about your limitations. The technology mogul who built his empire through a series of increasingly ambitious acquisitions maintained a public persona of barely controlled chaos. His social media presence featured impulsive statements, apparent contradictions, and seemingly irrational decisions that led competitors and analysts to consistently underestimate his strategic sophistication. Behind this carefully crafted facade, however, operated one of the most methodical and far-sighted planning operations in modern business. Each impulsive acquisition followed months of detailed analysis and strategic positioning. Each controversial statement served to distract attention from more significant moves occurring simultaneously. By the time competitors recognized the true scope of his capabilities, he had already secured unassailable positions in multiple critical markets. This principle extends beyond mere business strategy into all forms of human interaction. The negotiator who appears to struggle with complex concepts while simultaneously tracking every nuance of the discussion maintains a significant advantage over opponents who adjust their tactics based on false assumptions. The academic who presents their breakthrough research as fortunate accident rather than systematic innovation protects themselves from both intellectual theft and targeted sabotage. Rule 4: Convert every setback into strategic advantage. The capacity to transform apparent defeat into actual victory represents perhaps the most powerful skill in the modern strategic arsenal. This ability requires a fundamental shift in perspective, viewing obstacles not as problems to be overcome but as raw materials to be processed into beneficial outcomes. When the real estate magnate's flagship development project collapsed due to a combination of regulatory changes and market downturns, conventional wisdom suggested damage control and gradual recovery. Instead, he recognized the situation as an unprecedented opportunity to acquire distressed properties at historically low prices while simultaneously positioning himself as an expert in regulatory compliance for the new environment. The process began with a comprehensive analysis of why the project had failed, identifying every contributing factor from zoning restrictions to financing structures. Rather than viewing these obstacles as external impositions, he treated them as design parameters for future success. The regulatory changes that had destroyed his original project became the foundation for a new business model focused on helping other developers navigate the complex new landscape. Within 18 months, his consulting firm had become the dominant player in regulatory compliance for major development projects, generating revenue that far exceeded what the original project would have produced. More importantly, this new position provided unprecedented access to information about upcoming developments, zoning changes, and market opportunities throughout the region. The key insight underlying this transformation was the recognition that setbacks often reveal systemic weaknesses or emerging opportunities that were previously invisible. The individual who responds to failure with analysis rather than despair frequently discovers pathways to success that would never have been apparent from a position of comfortable stability. Rule 5: Cultivate strategic relationships without emotional attachment. Human connections form the infrastructure of power and influence in virtually every domain of modern activity. However, the emotional needs that drive most relationships often conflict with strategic objectives, creating unnecessary vulnerabilities and limiting options for advancement. The diplomatic attaché who built an extensive network of contacts across multiple governments and international organizations maintained relationships based purely on mutual benefit rather than personal affinity. She understood that emotional attachment to specific individuals or ideologies would inevitably compromise her effectiveness when circumstances required pivoting between opposing factions. Her approach involved systematic analysis of each contact's capabilities, motivations, and potential utility across various scenarios. She provided value to her network through carefully calibrated information sharing, strategic introductions, and occasional favor trading, but never allowed personal feelings to influence these calculations. When political upheavals required abandoning former allies or supporting previous opponents, she made these transitions smoothly and without internal conflict. This strategic approach to relationship building requires constant vigilance against the natural human tendency to conflate usefulness with affection. The individual who allows personal feelings to override strategic considerations will find themselves trapped by loyalties that no longer serve their objectives, unable to adapt when circumstances change. The cultivation of strategic relationships also demands absolute clarity about what you can offer and what you require in return. Vague promises of mutual support create ambiguous obligations that can be exploited by more sophisticated operators. Specific, measurable exchanges of value provide clear frameworks for ongoing interaction while minimizing the potential for misunderstanding or manipulation. Part 2. The architecture of dominance. The transition from defensive survival to offensive dominance requires a fundamental restructuring of how one perceives and interacts with the world. This transformation cannot occur gradually or partially. It demands complete commitment to a new operational philosophy that prioritizes results over comfort, effectiveness over popularity, and long-term positioning over short-term gratification. Rule 6. Control the narrative through information asymmetry. In an era where information moves at digital speed and public perception can shift within hours, the ability to shape how events are understood and interpreted becomes a decisive competitive advantage. This control emerges not from suppressing information but from strategically managing its flow, timing, and context. The biotech entrepreneur faced a crisis when preliminary clinical trial results for her company's breakthrough treatment showed mixed outcomes. Traditional corporate communications would have involved damage control, carefully worded statements about continuing research, and hopes that positive developments would eventually overshadow the disappointing data. Instead, she recognized an opportunity to control the entire narrative arc of her product's development. Over the following months, she orchestrated a careful sequence of information releases that told the story of scientific perseverance and iterative improvement. Initial publications focused on the treatment's innovative mechanism rather than clinical outcomes. Subsequent releases highlighted specific patient populations where results were most promising. Finally, when revised clinical protocols produced stronger data, the earlier setbacks were reframed as necessary learning experiences that had led to the ultimate breakthrough. This approach required intimate understanding of how different audiences process and interpret information. Medical professionals valued scientific rigor and incremental progress. Investors needed confidence in eventual commercial viability. Regulatory bodies demanded transparency about both successes and failures. Patient advocacy groups wanted hope balanced with realistic expectations. By tailoring the information flow to address each audience's specific concerns and decision-making frameworks, she maintained control over the overall narrative while providing each stakeholder group with the data they needed to support her objectives. The result was a product launch that generated enthusiasm rather than skepticism, positioned her company as a leader in responsible innovation rather than a risky speculation. Rule 7. Eliminate competition through superior positioning rather than direct confrontation. The weak approach to competitive advantage focuses on matching or exceeding opponents' strengths through direct comparison and confrontation. The strategic approach recognizes that the most decisive victories occur when competitors find themselves unable to respond effectively, regardless of their capabilities or resources. The software company founder faced established competitors with significantly larger development teams, marketing budgets, and market presence. Direct competition would have required matching their investments while hoping to differentiate through marginal improvements in product quality or pricing. Instead, he identified a fundamental shift in user behavior that his competitors' existing business models prevented them from addressing effectively. While established companies focused on enterprise sales with lengthy implementation cycles and complex customization requirements, he recognized that the future belonged to solutions that could be deployed immediately and modified through user-friendly interfaces. His product was designed from the ground up to serve this emerging market, with distribution channels, pricing models, and support systems that made it impossible for traditional vendors to compete effectively. The brilliance of this strategy lay not in superior technology but in superior positioning. When competitors attempted to respond with their own simplified offerings, they found themselves cannibalizing their existing high-margin enterprise business while lacking the operational infrastructure to serve the new market effectively. Their attempts to compete only accelerated their existing customers' migration to more agile alternatives. This principle extends beyond business competition into any situation where multiple parties compete for limited resources or opportunities. The academic who positions their research at the intersection of two traditionally separate disciplines often finds themselves with exclusive access to funding opportunities and collaboration possibilities that specialists in either field cannot access. The political candidate who successfully reframes debates around issues that favor their natural strengths forces opponents to fight on unfavorable terrain regardless of their campaign resources. Rule 8: Leverage systemic weaknesses rather than individual failures. Individual mistakes and personal shortcomings provide temporary tactical advantages, but systemic vulnerabilities offer sustainable strategic leverage. The individual who focuses on exploiting personal failures will find their advantages evaporating when those individuals are replaced or improve their performance. The individual who identifies and exploits systemic weaknesses gains access to ongoing advantages that persist regardless of personnel changes. The financial analyst who discovered systematic discrepancies in how certain investment firms calculated risk metrics could have attempted to profit from these errors through traditional arbitrage strategies. Instead, she recognized that the underlying cause, outdated regulatory frameworks that had not kept pace with modern financial instruments, represented a much larger opportunity. She developed a comprehensive proposal for new risk assessment methodologies that would correct these systemic issues while positioning her consulting firm as the leading expert in implementation and compliance. Her approach involved working with regulatory bodies to establish new standards rather than simply exploiting existing gaps. The result was a new regulatory framework that required every major financial institution to adopt methodologies that her firm was uniquely qualified to provide. This strategy transformed a temporary arbitrage opportunity into a sustainable competitive advantage that generated revenue for years while actually improving the overall stability of the financial system. Competitors who had focused on exploiting the same regulatory gaps found themselves suddenly disadvantaged when the rules changed, while she had positioned herself as an essential partner in adapting to the new environment. The identification of systemic weaknesses requires deep understanding of how complex systems actually function rather than how they are supposed to function. Most systems contain internal contradictions, outdated assumptions, and misaligned incentives that create persistent vulnerabilities for those who understand them. The individual who develops expertise in recognizing and addressing these systemic issues gains influence that extends far beyond their immediate area of operation. Rule 9: Master the timing of decisive action. The difference between brilliant strategy and catastrophic failure often reduces to a matter of timing. The same action that produces transformative success when executed at the optimal moment can result in devastating consequences when implemented prematurely or belatedly. This principle requires patience, preparation, and the ability to recognize when circumstances have aligned to maximize the probability of success. The pharmaceutical executive spent 3 years preparing for a single acquisition that would transform her company from a mid-tier generic manufacturer into a major player in specialized treatments. The target company possessed valuable intellectual property but was struggling with cash flow issues and regulatory challenges. Multiple attempts to negotiate acquisitions had failed due to timing misalignments and competitive bidding. Rather than pursuing immediate acquisition, she used the preparation period to systematically address every potential obstacle to success. She recruited key personnel from the target company while they were still employed there, gaining insider knowledge of their operational challenges and strategic vulnerabilities. She established relationships with regulatory officials who would need to approve any acquisition, ensuring that compliance issues would not derail the process. Most importantly, she prepared multiple financing structures that could be implemented rapidly when the optimal moment arrived. The decisive moment came when the target company faced simultaneous challenges: a major patent dispute that threatened their primary revenue stream, unexpected manufacturing problems that compromised their regulatory standing, and the departure of their chief scientific officer. These converging crises created a narrow window when acquisition became not just attractive but essential for the target company's survival. Her prepared response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, she had presented a complete acquisition package that addressed every crisis while providing the target company's management with an attractive exit strategy. Competitors who might have been interested had no time to develop competing offers, and regulatory approval was expedited due to her pre-existing relationships and documentation. The mastery of timing requires constant monitoring of multiple variables and the patience to wait for optimal convergence rather than acting on partial opportunities. It also demands the organizational capability to mobilize resources rapidly when the moment arrives, which means maintaining operational readiness even during periods of apparent inactivity. Rule 10. Build anti-fragile systems that benefit from chaos. Traditional strategic thinking focuses on building resilient systems that can survive disruption and return to previous functionality. Anti-fragile systems, by contrast, actually improve their performance when subjected to stress, uncertainty, or apparent chaos. The individual who constructs anti-fragile personal and professional systems gains advantages that compound during periods when others are struggling with adaptation. The investment manager who built his career during the financial crisis of 2008 recognized that traditional portfolio management strategies were fundamentally fragile. They worked well during stable periods but collapsed when underlying assumptions proved incorrect. Instead of trying to predict specific market movements or identify undervalued securities, he developed an investment approach that would benefit from increased volatility and uncertainty regardless of direction. His strategy involved constructing portfolios with limited downside exposure but unlimited upside potential, using combinations of options, convertible instruments, and asymmetric bets that cost little to maintain but generated exponential returns during periods of high volatility. When markets were calm, these positions produced modest gains while consuming minimal resources. When markets became chaotic, they generated returns that far exceeded losses in traditional holdings. More importantly, each period of market turmoil provided additional data about how different instruments and strategies performed under stress, allowing continuous refinement and optimization of the overall approach. Rather than viewing market crashes as disasters to be survived, he came to see them as opportunities for accelerated learning and profit generation. This principle extends beyond financial markets into all aspects of strategic planning. The entrepreneur who builds business models that benefit from economic uncertainty, the professional who develops skill sets that become more valuable during industry disruption, and the organization that gains market share when competitors are forced to retreat all exemplify anti-fragile design. The construction of anti-fragile systems requires abandoning the illusion of predictability and control in favor of adaptive responsiveness and opportunistic positioning. Rather than trying to prevent disruption, the goal becomes ensuring that disruption works in your favor regardless of its specific nature or timing. Part 3. The unstoppable mind. The ultimate expression of strategic superiority lies not in mastering external circumstances but in developing an internal operating system that remains effective regardless of environmental conditions. This psychological architecture must be constructed deliberately and maintained constantly, as the natural human tendency is always toward weakness, comfort, and compromise. Rule 11. Operate from absolute self-reliance. Dependence on external validation, support, or resources creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand your needs better than you recognize them yourself. The individual who achieves genuine self-reliance gains the freedom to make decisions based purely on strategic merit rather than the necessity of maintaining relationships or meeting others' expectations. The technology executive who built her reputation through a series of successful startups discovered that her growing prominence had created subtle dependencies on industry recognition, media attention, and peer approval that were beginning to influence her decision-making in suboptimal ways. Projects were selected partly based on their potential for generating positive coverage rather than solely on their strategic value. Hiring decisions were influenced by candidates' social connections within the industry rather than purely on their capabilities. Recognizing these dependencies as strategic liabilities, she deliberately restructured her operations to eliminate external validation as a significant factor. She moved her primary operations away from traditional tech centers to regions where industry opinion carried less weight. She established alternative funding sources that reduced dependence on conventional venture capital networks. Most importantly, she developed internal metrics for success that were completely independent of external recognition or approval. This process required identifying and systematically eliminating every area where external opinion could influence critical decisions. Product development focused entirely on user value rather than industry trends.
Personnel decisions were based on demonstrated competence rather than cultural fit or networking potential. Strategic partnerships were evaluated purely on their contribution to operational objectives rather than their impact on company reputation. The result was a level of strategic flexibility that competitors could not match. While they remained constrained by the need to maintain relationships and meet market expectations, she could pivot rapidly between radically different approaches based solely on their effectiveness. When industry conditions changed, her responses were immediate and decisive rather than delayed by consultation processes or reputation management concerns. Self-reliance extends beyond operational independence into psychological autonomy. The individual who requires external approval for self-worth will inevitably compromise strategic objectives to maintain that approval. True self-reliance means deriving satisfaction primarily from the successful execution of chosen strategies rather than from others' recognition of that success. Rule 12. Maintain strategic emotional distance. Emotional investment in outcomes creates psychological pressure that distorts judgment and reduces tactical flexibility. The individual who remains emotionally detached from specific results can evaluate situations objectively and adjust strategies based on emerging data rather than defending previous decisions or pursuing personal vindication. The diplomat who negotiated a series of complex international trade agreements discovered that his initial approach was compromised by emotional attachment to elegant solutions and personal pride in creative problem solving. These psychological investments led him to continue pursuing negotiations that were no longer strategically viable while missing opportunities for simpler but more effective alternatives. He developed a systematic approach to emotional management that treated his psychological responses as data to be analyzed rather than impulses to be followed. When he found himself becoming attached to particular negotiation strategies, he would deliberately explore alternatives that contradicted his preferences. When he felt personal animosity toward opposing negotiators, he would intensify his analysis of their underlying interests and constraints rather than allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. This approach required constant self-monitoring and the willingness to abandon personally satisfying approaches when they proved suboptimal. It also demanded the cultivation of satisfaction from the process of strategic thinking itself rather than from achieving specific predefined outcomes. The goal became optimal decision-making rather than vindication of particular preferences or assumptions. The maintenance of strategic emotional distance does not mean eliminating emotion entirely, which would be neither possible nor beneficial. Instead, it requires treating emotional responses as additional information sources while preventing them from overriding analytical judgment. Fear provides data about potential risks that require attention. Anger identifies threats that may need to be addressed. Excitement highlights opportunities that merit investigation. The key is using these emotional inputs to inform analysis rather than allowing them to drive decisions directly. Rule 13. Destroy your weak self continuously. The weak self is not a fixed entity that can be eliminated through a single transformative effort. It is a persistent tendency that reasserts itself whenever circumstances allow comfort and complacency to replace vigilance and discipline. The maintenance of strategic superiority requires ongoing identification and elimination of emerging weaknesses before they compromise operational effectiveness. The investment fund manager who achieved remarkable success through disciplined application of systematic strategies discovered that success itself had created new forms of weakness. Growing wealth had reduced his motivation for careful analysis. Media recognition had increased his confidence in intuitive judgments. Industry respect had made him less willing to pursue contrarian positions that might damage his reputation. He instituted a formal process of quarterly self-evaluation designed to identify emerging psychological vulnerabilities and operational complacencies. This analysis examined not only investment performance but also decision-making processes, risk assessment procedures, and the subtle influences of external validation on strategic choices. Each identified weakness triggered specific countermeasures designed to restore optimal functioning. The process was deliberately uncomfortable and often revealed inconvenient truths about declining performance or compromised judgment. However, this discomfort served as an early warning system that prevented minor degradations from developing into serious strategic liabilities. By confronting emerging weaknesses while they were still manageable, he maintained performance levels that would have been impossible through purely reactive approaches. The destruction of the weak self must be systematic rather than sporadic.
It requires regular examination of motivations, assumptions, and decision-making processes to identify areas where comfort has replaced rigor, where assumptions have replaced analysis, or where emotional needs have begun to override strategic objectives. This ongoing process of self-renewal ensures that capabilities continue to develop rather than merely being maintained. The complete synthesis, the unstoppable individual. The integration of these 13 principles creates an individual who operates according to fundamentally different rules than those governing conventional behavior. This person has eliminated the primary sources of weakness that limit most people's effectiveness: emotional reactivity, dependence on external validation, attachment to specific outcomes, and the illusion that moral purity and strategic effectiveness can be seamlessly aligned. The unstoppable individual recognizes that the world operates according to power dynamics rather than moral ideals, and constructs their approach accordingly while maintaining sufficient ethical boundaries to ensure sustainable operation. They understand that genuine strength comes not from avoiding difficult decisions but from making them with clarity and commitment. They know that true freedom requires accepting responsibility for outcomes rather than seeking to distribute blame or share credit. Most importantly, they have internalized the understanding that becoming unstoppable is not a destination but a continuous process of adaptation, refinement, and renewal. The external world continues to evolve, creating new challenges and opportunities that require ongoing strategic development. The internal world continues to generate new forms of weakness and complacency that must be identified and addressed before they compromise effectiveness. The man who has truly destroyed his weak self has not eliminated all vulnerability but has created a system that transforms vulnerability into strength, obstacles into opportunities, and setbacks into strategic intelligence. He cannot be destroyed by others because he has made destruction and reconstruction a deliberate and ongoing practice, ensuring that external attacks encounter no fixed target but rather a dynamic system that adapts and strengthens under pressure. This is not a comfortable existence, nor is it one that will earn universal approval or admiration. It requires sacrificing the psychological comforts that most people consider essential: the illusion of moral certainty, the safety of conventional thinking, and the warmth of unconditional relationships. However, for those willing to pay this price, it offers something far more valuable: the capability to shape reality according to their vision rather than merely responding to circumstances created by others. In the year 2026, as technological acceleration continues to disrupt traditional structures and new forms of competition emerge across all domains of human activity, these principles provide a framework for not merely surviving change but directing it toward chosen objectives. The individual who masters these dark rules gains access to possibilities that remain permanently closed to those who insist on operating according to more comfortable but less effective conventional wisdom. The choice between strength and weakness, between effectiveness and comfort, between strategic superiority and moral convenience, presents itself to every individual countless times throughout their existence. The unstoppable person is distinguished not by perfect judgment but by consistent willingness to choose difficulty over ease, clarity over comfort, and power over popularity when these choices align with their ultimate objectives. The weak self seeks to avoid this choice, hoping that circumstances will somehow align to make the difficult path unnecessary. The strong self recognizes that this alignment never occurs naturally and must be created through deliberate action based on clear strategic thinking. The unstoppable self has transcended the need for this choice entirely by constructing an existence where strength, effectiveness, and strategic superiority have become natural expressions of a fundamentally reconstructed psychology rather than occasional heroic efforts. This document serves not as entertainment or motivation but as a technical manual for those prepared to undertake the complex and demanding work of personal transformation required to achieve genuine strategic superiority. The principles described here are not theoretical constructs but practical tools that have been tested and refined through application in the most demanding environments of modern competition. Their effectiveness depends not on partial implementation or selective application but on complete integration into a coherent operational philosophy that governs all aspects of decision-making and behavior. The individual who attempts to apply these principles while maintaining conventional attachments and assumptions will find them ineffective at best and potentially counterproductive. However, the individual who commits fully to this path of development will discover capabilities and possibilities that far exceed what conventional approaches can provide. The year 2026 offers unprecedented opportunities for those equipped with the psychological tools to recognize and exploit them. The question is not whether these opportunities exist, they are abundant and growing, but whether you possess the strategic sophistication and personal strength necessary to claim them. The 13 Dark Rules provide a proven framework for developing these capabilities, but only for those willing to pay the full price of genuine transformation rather than seeking the comfortable illusion of improvement without fundamental change.